can see, but we've got a bunch of people here from my team.
Yeah, I can see all these amazing people: James, Paul, Sheldon, Richard, Donald White, etc.
Exactly. So I was just telling them that we'll just kind of keep them mute most of the time, so it's not like overcrowded. We'll kind of treat it somewhat like a podcast style. And
yeah, I mean, if anyone has questions, it could be pretty cool.
Okay, sweet. Well, I just wanted to start by introducing you. I'm not good with introductions. I haven't done this a whole lot, but I'm just going to read off a couple of the things that I'd written down. So this is my good friend, Ben, from, we've known each other since elementary school. And he, when he turned 19, served a 2-year service mission for his church. After that, he studied at Brigham Young University, where you met your wife, Lauren, right?
Mm-hmm.
You met her at BYU?
Yeah.
He ended up getting his PhD in Clemson, in South Carolina, where he started the process of adopting 3 foster children. And along that way, he became the #1 writer on Medium.com from 2015 to 2018, which is a big deal because if any of you are unfamiliar with Medium.com, it's subscriber based. They will upvote your content. So the fact that he was the #1 writer is pretty impressive. He grew a subscription base of almost 500,000 people in that time, which is why he was able to secure a book deal with his best-selling book, Willpower Doesn't Work. He's delivered 2 TED Talks, over 1 million views on TED. He's currently getting ready to release his book, Personality Isn't Permanent. And he continues to coach and mentor people through his books and programs. Is that pretty good? Is that a pretty good summary of your accolades?
It's a lot. Yeah, but yeah, that's good.
Yeah, for sure. Ben actually introduced us. We had Nate Lambert on a few weeks ago.
Yeah, Nate's a funny guy, right?
Yeah. He was your professor at BYU, right? What was your?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. What was your experience with him? He helped you get into writing, or?
No, I was already into writing before I met Nate, but he was a professor, and I was thinking I was going to become a professor. Although I really wanted to just write books. I wanted to be a professional writer, but I wasn't really sure how to get there at that time. And he was a publishing beast. And so I just really liked Nate's style. He was very motivated. This was before he leaped out of academia and became like a real estate monster. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But he was just very entrepreneurial, very motivated. And that was kind of my line of thinking as well. I just really wanted to be ambitious. And so he helped me get into graduate school, essentially. We became accountability partners. This was back in like 2013. And it was back then that he was very much like getting excited about real estate. He ended up leaving BYU and like jumping into, and you can mute people. For example, Les, you can just mute him. But yeah, it was interesting to watch him. He actually lost his job at BYU because he was publishing too much. He was too successful. And in academia, people kick you out if you're doing too well. And so he lost his job, and that led me to realizing I didn't want to be a professor. And so, it pushed me down that more entrepreneurial path, even though that was kind of the path I was probably going to go on anyways.
Interesting. Cool. So you wanted to be a professor at some point, but.
Yeah, I was thinking that would be something I do temporarily while I'm like building a writing career.
Awesome. So I actually read through your book, the Personality Isn't Permanent. You sent me an advanced copy of it. And one of my favorite chapters was chapter 3, Transform Your Trauma. And you talked about, I re-listened to it this morning. You talked about something called math trauma, which I thought was interesting. Math trauma is, in a nutshell, people get anxiety from doing math, and I can actually relate with this. And because they do poorly on maybe 1 or 2 math problems, they tell themselves this narrative that, oh, I'm just not good at math. I'm not a math person. And obviously that's a fixed mindset trait. But I was going to bring this up. Do you think that's a problem with our school system at large? Do you think that the fixed mindset, do you think our education system's flawed?
Probably. Yeah. I think that there's not good coaching. For example, anyone in this meeting, I don't know what all of your goals are, but whatever your goals are, you're going to hit a lot of obstacles along the way. You're going to get doors slammed on your face, or however, whatever the obstacles are between you and whatever your goal is. If your goal is to become a millionaire or to have a ton of, I'm not exactly sure the situation here with everyone and all of your individual goals, but you're going to hit walls along the way, and those walls could become traumas. If you hit a wall and it's a big failure, or it's something that leads you to question the goal, if you don't get emotional support, or if you don't reframe the experience so that it's a positive learning experience, then it's going to be, you're going to turn it into a narrative where you're going to say, I'm not that great at this anymore, or this is something I don't want to do anymore. And so there's a really good quote that basically says, we're kept from our goals, not by obstacles, but by a clear path to a lesser goal. So I think with the education system, there's not really good coaching or emotional support through the learning. Instead, it's like if someone's not good, they just get a bad score, And so it's like, okay, I guess I'm not that good at this because I failed this test. I guess I shouldn't do math anymore, rather than helping them develop a sense of goals and helping them through the emotional process of learning.
Right. Like the story of, I think her name was Laura Lee. Is that right?
It was, I don't remember the name of her, but yeah, this is a great story about that.
Yeah,
Should I share it with them? Like yeah, go ahead, tell them.
yeah. I mean, you can go ahead for sure, because you met her at a family reunion. She will want to be a book author. Yeah, go ahead. You can
Yeah, I'll tell the story. So this is someone I met at a family reunion, essentially, and this person is really intelligent. She went to, I think she went to Yale or Stanford, and then she went to Cornell for a master's degree. Brilliant writer, but she wanted to write kids' books. And so she wanted to write and illustrate kids' books. And so when she was in her 30s, she took a private art lesson in New York City. That's where she lived with her young kids. And in that private art lesson, there was about 6 other people in the room. And there was like, they were doing this certain exercise. And the teacher came up and started correcting her. He was writing on her easel board and correcting her work. And during about the 30 to 60 seconds that the guy was correcting her work, this family member of mine was incredibly embarrassed. Like all of the other 6 people were watching her. And because she was feeling so much embarrassment that this guy was correcting her so vocally or publicly, the idea popped in her head, I'm not good at this. I must not be very good at drawing. And so it was just that emotional. And usually with trauma, what happens is you have an initial reaction. We have initial reactions all the time. If someone cuts you off on the road, you're going to have a reaction, probably. The problem with traumas is that reaction is never dealt with. So usually if you get hit on the road, you handle it. You handle the situation. In psychology, we call it a refractory period. So like the refractory period is the amount of time it takes to emotionally recover from an event. If someone's super rude to you when you knock on the door and you're trying to sell solar or something, it might, you get used to it after a while, right? But in the beginning, it might hurt enough where you're like, I must not be good at this. And so that's kind of what happened to her, and so basically with a refractory period, hopefully recover from it quickly. So like Kobe Bryant, as an example, he talked a lot about how like when he would shoot a shot, if he missed, he would shoot again the next time. He didn't worry about it too much. But some people, if they shot and missed, they might not shoot the next time because they're still worried about missing that last shot. And so you want to shrink the refractory period so that you can quickly emotionally recover from whatever happens so that you can just keep moving forward and learning. But with a lot of traumas, you never end up actually finishing the refractory period. You have some negative event, but you didn't choose to keep going. You didn't reframe it. And so instead, you're still defined by that past experience. And that you don't want that to happen. You don't want to be defined by some negative past experience. You want to be defined by your goals. And so, this person, this family member of mine, she's still, this is 40 or 50 years ago. She still told me at the family reunion not too long ago, now she's in her 80s, that she wishes that she could draw kids' books. She still wants to do it. It's still a dream of hers, but she genuinely doesn't believe she can draw. And that's because that fixed mindset was shaped during that one experience that she's still defined by.
So did you help her overcome that, do you think? You kind of allude to that. Has she come around? Is she
we didn't focus on it too much because I haven't spent that much time with her. Yeah. But I definitely, I told her, well, what would have happened if you had written and just attempted a few kids' books, even if they weren't that good, like you know.
Right, right, right.
Could you have gotten better if you had drawn and continued getting lessons, and maybe in the last 50 years written like a couple dozen kids books? Do you think that you could have gotten better at it? And she's like, no, I just don't have the native ability, but I think I was jogging her mind, and I was I didn't really work on it that hard because it was just a short time we were together.
Sure, sure, that makes sense. I think I've heard you say this, and if not from you, definitely in psychology, that when you have a trauma, like when you're young, like she was young and in school, and every time she revisits that trauma emotionally, she becomes that age again. Am I explaining that right?
If it's not reframed, yes. Yeah, our memory is fluid, it's flexible. So like anyone, think about it. Like if you have a bad day, or maybe you have a horrible experience like selling solar, but in the future, once you've gotten really good at it, you can look at those former experiences and kind of laugh. You can be like, I've come a long way. But if you haven't reframed it, if you haven't gone back and thought about it, or if you haven't kept moving forward, then yeah, you still see the event as if it was still occurring. You haven't actually changed your view of the past, because your view of the past is very much based on who you are today. And so if you haven't changed your view of a former experience, then that means you haven't thought about it and chosen how to think about it. Like there's a really good book I'd recommend for anyone, especially today. It's called Man's Search for Meaning. Man's Search for Meaning is a really good book about a guy who lived through the German concentration camps. And the meaning you give to your experiences determines who you are as a person. And so that person, for example, my distant relative, she gave a lot of meaning to that event. The meaning she gave to it was, oh, this guy's correcting my work, therefore I'm not good at it. That's meaning she gave to it. That's not an objective reality. That was the meaning she gave to an experience. And so whatever negative experiences you have in the past, what you have to realize is that it's more based on the meaning you gave to the experience than what actually occurred. And you can change the meaning.
Right.
That's the crucial aspect of this, is that you change the meaning of what happened to be something that would be supportive of your goals versus just being defined by whatever occurred.
Right. Well, that's what I thought was interesting about the story is her, from what I gathered, her professor, her teacher didn't actually come in and say, hey, you suck. This is why I'm correcting you. He might have even been like, hey, I see the most potential in you, and that's why I'm trying to help you. He might have.
But she didn't know that.
Yeah, well, and whether it's right or wrong, yeah, she just immediately assigned this offense to it, right?
Yeah, usually because an event's negative. Often if you're not thoughtful about it, you make meaning based on your emotions, not based on what's actually happening. Like maybe, she did have some negative emotions. You shouldn't actually critically judge your initial reaction. Like if she was embarrassed, there's nothing to be judged there, but maybe the next step would be asking the professor after the class, or maybe even telling him, first off, maybe going home and telling your husband or telling someone. One of the challenges with trauma is you don't talk about it. You just suppress it. You don't deal with it. So she could have gone home and talked to her husband and said, look, I had a really bad experience. I don't think I want to do this anymore. And he maybe would have encouraged her to say, well, what happened? You know what I mean? And like, oh, maybe the professor didn't mean that. Maybe you should go ask him, or maybe you should tell him, and she could have gotten other perspectives, or maybe she could have gotten another professor. But she never really got further information or explanation. And so she made a lot of assumptions about the situation just because of her emotions, rather than dealing with it and getting more information. Like she really could have, exactly what you said, she could have talked to him and realized he had no negative intentions. She could have talked to all the other people in the class and they could have said, she was embarrassed, but she maybe didn't have need to be. Like I'll give an example. Like I myself, and Benny knows this, when I grew up, my parents got divorced when I was 11, and my father particularly became a very heavy drug addict. And all through my junior high and high school years, my father was pretty messed up. Great dude though. Ended up overcoming his addictions actually when I was on my mission. He and I are great friends. He's in a great place right now. But when I was going through junior high and high school, I of course was forming a lot of meaning on those experiences. Like it was a pretty traumatic experience to watch your father become an extreme drug addict and stuff like that. But going back and revisiting the experience, which is something I would invite you to do in your journal, but also in talking about it. So there's a really good quote from the book where I talk about how trauma isn't what happens to you, it's what you hold on the inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. So it's what you hold on the inside in the absence of someone who can see you, support you, to help you through it. Because you need to reframe it. You need to start changing the meaning of it. It's not about you. Actually, we just barely did an intervention for my brother, Trevor. And one of the big things that we helped him realize is that he's not the problem. The addiction's the problem. You know, it's like, it's not about you. It's about how you're seeing the experience or how you're feeling about it. Anyway, while I was writing this book, I decided that I wanted to get greater context or perspective into my former experience, because context matters more than content. Like, I'll give an example. Like, in an email recently, I sent an email to my email list and I used the word viral. I said an article is going viral right now. And I had like 5 people email me, or probably 20 actually. And they said, please don't use that word viral, because we're in the middle of COVID-19, right?
Right.
And so if I would have used that word maybe like 2 months ago, it wouldn't have triggered people. But this just shows that context matters more than content. The context shapes the meaning of the content. So the word viral right now maybe has a different meaning to some people than it did 2 months ago. And so you can reshape the context to change the meaning of the content. I'm not telling you that you're literally changing the events of the past. You're changing the perspective of the meaning. I actually, I talked to my dad while writing this book, and I just wanted to know everything about his perspective of what happened, what led him to getting deep into drugs, what his perspective was of the whole situation. Cause me and my brother ultimately had to like leave the situation and abandon him for a few years. And I learned so many things that I had no clue of, nor could I have had a clue of when I was 11 or 12 years old. And when I was an 11 or 12-year-old person, I was forming a perspective of those events. And if I hadn't gone back through and reframed the meaning of them, I'd still be seeing those events if I was still that same person, which would obviously greatly limit my current self. And so it's important to realize that your former self, you have a relationship with the former version of you. You all have a past, you all have a memory, but it's not objective. What was interesting in me finding out about more of my dad's situation, I heard about like his own childhood issues, you know, and things that, you know, and even the situation that led to my parents' divorce. And so once I got more understanding and more context, I was actually pretty understanding of why he ended up becoming a drug addict. And I was like, I'm not saying I would have done the same thing, but I'm like, holy cow, I can understand what led to that.
And
And
rather
that,
than resenting him, maybe you were a little bit more
yeah.
like,
Well, and
oh,
there's a really good book actually. It's called Too Soon Old, Too Late Smart. It's by a guy named Gordon Livingston. He's dead now, but he talks about how your past is a fiction. Your past is a story that literally you tell. Your
right,
identity is how you tell your own story, and you can choose to tell whatever story you want. And you can choose to view people from your past as villains or heroes, you know, and there was a time when my dad was the villain in my story. Now he's a hero in my story. I get to choose that narrative. Neither one is actually true. I get to choose what's true in my past. And obviously there's a lot about choosing what's true for your future as well. But you need to take ownership of your narrative, because what's interesting is if you don't, then your future is actually very limited by your past. That's why they say that personality can often become a coping mechanism. Who you are and what you're limited or what you choose to do can be based on narratives you've formed because of events in your past. And you don't want that. Like, you don't want to have a limiting future because of some negative experiences you've had in the past.
right. Well, and one thing I want to tell everybody listening to this call right now, and if anyone sees this in the future, is you, Ben, are the prime example of the things you write about. You know, like talking about how somebody can change. I mean, we were altogether pretty unimpressive kids in high school. You know, like we didn't really take it seriously. We didn't like go to class a bunch, and you know, I I would
We
say,
never went to class. I still have no clue how we graduated high school personally.
exactly, and that's the funny thing. And there's a really funny story when we worked at Einstein's together, right? And you know, watching Ben no call and no show at Einstein's, and we called it, we made it a verb, right? We called it pulling a Hardy, right? It was like, oh dude, let's don't go to your job, let's pull a Hardy, right? And you know, and I don't say that to make fun, but I say that to give you extreme credit for these amazing accolades you've been able to accomplish. I mean, if you sit here and say, you know, personality isn't permanent, right? You're the prime example of this, right? When did that shift start to happen for you? When did you start to realize that, you know, you weren't indicative? If your school teacher told you you amount to nothing, when did you realize that's not necessarily true?
Yeah. I mean, and I can explain kind of the research perspective of it, which is really cool. But as for myself, I think it was when I went on the mission. Like, I watched myself. I mean, I was already, there's a lot of research that talks about how your number, you know, most people's number one regret on their deathbed is that they didn't have the courage to be the person they wanted to be. Instead, they live up to the expectations of those around them. So it can be really easy to get stuck in a role and stuck in a persona because you've got a social group that kind of keeps you stuck the way you are. And so, like, I was already not necessarily happy with the person I was, but I was kind of reactive to a situation, you know, and you kind of get stuck into rhythms. Like, they say that your role or your environment really predicts who you are. And so obviously you got to change those things. But when I went on the mission, I had a new role. I had a new environment. I had already gone through enough trauma and baggage from the past that like I knew I didn't want that. Like it was my choice to go on that mission. And so that's when I really started to live intentionally, started to journal a lot, started to read a ton of books. I told people, and my leader, for example, the mission president, about all that I experienced, and he helped me to like focus on the future. He's the one who told me to get a ton of education. And so it's kind of like COVID-19. Like I think a lot of people are just waiting to get to the end of this experience. And there's other people who are using this experience to maximize their time. And for me on my mission, I was not just trying to get to the end of it. I was trying to see absolutely how much juice I could squeeze out of it. You know what I mean? And that could be the same for like this situation, like with your guys's job. Like, you know, like you could just get to a goal or get to a time, or you can squeeze as much out of it as you can. And like, I think there's a lot of people squeezing a lot of juice out of this COVID-19 situation. And a lot of people are just waiting till it's over. So for me, I just decided to go as deep as I could. You know, like we just example, yesterday I dropped my brother off at like an intervention facility. It's 3 months.
Cool.
And like he could just get to the end of those 3 months, or he could really squeeze as much juice as he can out of the experience and transform a lot in those 3 months, right? And so I just decided to just transform as much as I could. And you can't really do that without a goal. Like even Viktor Frankl talks about that. You need a future self. Without a goal, you actually don't have a purpose in your life. And so like, then your present becomes really crappy. So I got really good at focusing on my future, clarifying who I wanted to be, and spending my days becoming that person. And so when I came home, I then could create visions and go through college really fast and achieve goals fast.
That's pretty cool, because that doesn't happen for everyone, by the way. Like I grew up in the same culture as you, where a lot of people go on 2-year service missions. And a lot of people actually might think that, you know, serving a 2-year service mission for a church sounds pretty impressive. But in our culture, it was like,
it was expected.
Yeah. Like if you don't go, it's like, whoa, like you're not that cool. Like, why aren't you like everyone else? So, you know, from my perspective, and this is again, to give you credit, that there's a lot of people who would go through like what could be a life transforming experience like that and not change. So, you know, the fact that you changed so much exponentially is like, would you say that was the secret, was having a really good, clear path of what you want to become in your future? And
that's what became the secret. That's what becomes the secret, is you can't live positively in the present without a clear future. But a lot of it was just journaling a lot, you know, and actually like how I look at personality is your personality is your comfort zone. You know, if you're comfortable doing things a certain way, you're going to do them regularly. To do something outside of your comfort zone is to do something outside of your typical way of doing it. So I started to become a lot more courageous in that situation. You know, I think you and we had a lot of experience like breaking social norms, you know, so like we had examples of being courage. But I think that on my mission, not only did I spend a lot of time journaling, and when you're journaling and just thinking about who you want to be and living intentionally, you can start to kind of clarify your thinking, clarify your identity, clarify what you're trying to accomplish, and you get a lot more out of your learning and your experience that way. Like, it's not good to keep repeating your experience over and over again. And journaling is a way for you to kind of clarify what you're learning, so you don't have to keep repeating your experience, but you can learn from it so that you can have better and different experiences. And so I was just not repeating my days as a missionary. I was having different, progressively better days over and over, and acting differently every single day because I was updating my identity and trying new things. And I think that with what you guys are doing, you guys could, you know, whether you're selling solar, is this about selling solar in a lot of ways, right? Is this your group, or is this a real estate group? What is the group anyways? I want to make sure I'm like not talking in like, you know.
No. So everybody on this call right now is a part of our team. Some live in North Carolina, some live in.
But is the team to sell solar, right?
It is. Yeah, it is. But this isn't necessarily about that. We just.
Yeah, I know it's not. It's not. I know this is totally different. I'm just using it as an example.
Okay. Yeah.
Like someone who's going door to door, right? Like if they're not actively learning from their experience, they could kind of just go through a whole summer repeating that experience.
Right. Yeah, and not learn from.
But you could learn from every door if you're really seeking something specific. You know what I mean? And then you take what you learned and do something different.
Yeah. Was someone going to say something? Rosie, were you going to chime in?
I just want to say, yeah, you learn something with every door, every experience, every customer. You better yourself. Sometimes you make mistakes, and sometimes you just pick up things.
Yeah, and I was going to ask, like, so how do you make sure that you learn from that? Is Would you say that journaling and writing about your experience is important in that process?
I don't usually journal it, but I will talk about it to somebody else, especially if you're
That's good.
trying to influence somebody new, and then you kind of let them know like what not to do. Or even when you mess up, you let them know, don't worry, it's going to happen, even when you've been in the business for a few years. So don't, just get over it, laugh about it, and move on.
I think
Right.
that's really good advice. Yeah,
And then
letting
of
go
course,
of it, not over attaching to it one way or another.
yeah, and then of course, when you have your successes, model that, keep using that strategy.
For sure. By the way, does anyone have anything they want to add in real quick, or any questions they want to throw in? We don't have to keep it super rigid.
I just want to say thank you for saying that, because I've been journaling for the last month, and that's kind of like my morning routine is I get up and I journal every morning.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of, sometimes I'm like, I don't know what to write about today, and I've kind of been like losing my momentum on it, and you just kind of validated it for me. So I just want to say thank you.
Yeah.
Well, your journal today would look something like: get up, wash face, turn on TV, sit on couch, news, look at computer, go to bed.
Yeah.
Yeah, journaling is really key. I would also, if you're thinking about your future self and taking the time, so like, I'll just give a little bit of the background on the research on personality change and also just identity, because I think it's really helpful. So I would check out, and I've already told you guys the TED Talk, The Psychology of Your Future Self. Definitely watch that. It's like 6 minutes long. But basically, here's how to think about it. This psychologist, his name's Daniel Gilbert, he spent a lot of time asking people, are you the same person as you were 10 years ago? And so like, if I were to ask that question to Benny, like, Benny, are you the exact same person you were 10 years ago? What would you say?
No, by no means.
Yeah. And I think that everyone on this call would actually probably say the exact same thing. Like, no one on this call is probably the exact same person they were 10 years ago. Some people have probably changed more than others, especially those seeking change, but none of you are the exact same person. None of you see the world the same way. None of you have the same goals or preferences or exact priorities that you had 10 years ago. And so what Gilbert does is he asks people, what about who you're going to be in the future? Are you going to be just as different in 10 years from now as you were 10 years ago? And most people don't think so. Most people think that who they are right now is mostly pretty developed version of themselves. Like, yeah, they'll change a little bit, but for the most part, they're pretty clear on who they are at this point. And so that's actually really a problem. That's a bad thing. It's better to realize that your future self is going to be just as different as who you are from your former self. Your future self is not the same person you are today. And it's actually really good for identity and for just decision making to realize that you're going to be a very different person in the future. So what Daniel Gilbert says is, he says, human beings are works in progress that mistakenly think they're finished. We think that who we are today is who we're mostly going to be. That's really bad for identity and for goal setting and for decision making. What a lot of the researchers these days show, and I think it's common sense after you hear it, is it's actually impossible to make good decisions today if you don't know who you want to be in the future. Because if you don't know who your future self is, then it really doesn't matter what you do today. You literally could just sit on the couch and do nothing because you have no goal. And so in order to make really good decisions in the present, you have to actually have a very specific future in mind. And the only way to create that future is to actually create it. And that's, I think, where the journaling comes in, and maybe even the daily journaling, is you have to think about who you want to be. And that includes your attributes, your circumstances, your situation, your relationships. And the more creative you get at that process, then the better you can actually start doing things about it today. So today, I could remind myself in my journal about who I want to be, and then I could start to get inspiration or ideas about what I can do to courageously or do something today. That's, I think, why there's a really good quote that says, the bigger the future, the better the present. Because whatever your future is, if you have a huge future, then your present's going to be kind of crazy, because you're going to be probably doing a lot of things outside your norm. You're going to be trying things that might not work. You're going to be being courageous. You're going to be failing, learning. So that makes for a better present if you're working towards something specific. And that's actually what Frankl says as well. He says when people lose a future in the concentration camps, they die.
Well, and that was the cool thing about Viktor Frankl, was he pictured himself teaching others about his experience. And he was one of the few that made it out of the concentration camps. And he ended up living his future, right? Didn't he become a professor and teach people?
Totally. Yeah. But he needed that meaning, like your life loses meaning if you don't have a future, and your present starts to become pretty stale if you're not actively seeking a future. And so that's why the bigger the future, the better the present. It's impossible to have a good present if you're not actively working towards a future.
Well, and maybe too many people right now are looking towards their past. If they're thinking like they want to go on a diet, they look at what they've done in the past. But really, you should be like, hey, well, I'm extremely fit in my future, and to contribute to that future, I'm not gonna indulge. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. So here's kind of the big rub. This is the rub, is that, and this is one of the dogmas in psychology, is that is this is kind of a core doctrine, you could say, in psychology, is that the best way to predict a person's future behavior is by looking at their past. And so if I want to understand you, is all I got to do is look at your past, and I can have a pretty good snapshot as far as what I think you'll do. Now, that's for most people. That's based on typical behavior for most people. If anyone who's listening to this who wants to actually create a better future, you don't want your past to predict your behavior. You want your future to predict your behavior. And so there's a concept in psychology. It's called identity narrative, and it's basically your identity narrative is the way you explain yourself. So this is why tests like Myers-Briggs or, personality tests are so popular, is because they give you an identity where you can explain yourself. I'm an INTJ, or I'm a blue, I'm a red. Like having a way to explain yourself is how your identity works. And usually most people explain themselves the same way. They've been explaining themselves the same way for several years. I'm not a creative person, as an example. They may say that, or I'm an introvert, or we explain ourselves very similar ways, and it's often based on our past. What happens when your life starts to really shift, once you've clarified your future self, you've defined it, is when you start telling people about your future self and acknowledging that they're a different person than you are today. They're not the same person. So if your future self is a millionaire, just as an example, and if you're just like successful in various ways, and you can define it out however you want. You're living in California, you're married with 3 kids, however you want to define your future self. That then becomes the story you tell, rather than continuing to tell the story about your former identity or overly defining your current self. Because you don't ever want to overly define your current self, because your future self is different from your future self. Your current self is temporary. So why would you be so definitive about who you are today? What matters actually more is who you're going to be in the future. And that should be the thing that's shaping what you do today. So it's really powerful, and it often does take courage to just be open and blunt and honest about your goals to everyone. Tell people about what you're doing and what you're trying to accomplish. Yes, some people may disagree, but that actually really helps you clarify your environment and clarify who's in your life. It also helps you to get around people who will encourage your future self. But it also leads you to feeling compelled to act in accordance with your new story, which then means that your future self, your behavior rather than your former self.
Yeah, you brought up environment. I'm glad you brought that up, because you talk a lot about that in your last book, Willpower Doesn't Work, and you talk about how shaping your environment will shape your thoughts. How important is it for somebody to move away, for example? Would it be important to move away from your house if your current environment is reminding you constantly of your past, or can you fight through it? Can you?
Yeah, go ahead. I mean, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, Benny, but I mean, you don't necessarily have to leave the state or the city, although that can make it a lot easier. I mean, I think you live in California, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that makes it a lot easier. I'm not saying it's required, but you certainly need to make a huge adjustment to your environment. So you don't have to literally move states, although that could make things a lot easier, or go to a different country. But yeah, you definitely do need to change your environment. So there's a really good quote that basically says your input shapes your outlook, and there's so much research, but I think it's just obvious when you really think about it. Your peer group really predicts almost everything about what you become. So your peer group will determine how much money you make, how religious you are, how likely you are to be an alcoholic or a criminal. So yeah, your environment really heavily shapes you. Your input shapes you. The information you consume shapes you. The experiences you consume shape you. The food you eat shapes you. And so you want to be aware of the external things coming in, and the people you're around, and the experiences you're typically having. And once you realize that, so your environment is one of the big things that obviously drives and shapes who you are. If you're still in the same situations as you were 3 or 4 years ago, you're probably a similar person as you were 3 or 4 years ago to some degree. And so once you realize that and you clarify your future self, then you want to think, what are the experiences and the situations and the people that my future self is around? And you can make quantum leaps when you start doing that. You can start surrounding yourself in situations and around people that are, way above your current self to some degree as it relates to your goal. And then you can quickly adapt to that identity in that new environment.
Yeah, no, I I would agree with you. I don't think that it's like necessary, but I think it's pretty crucial. Like for me, moving away was a really big.
It's good. It was probably great for you, right?
It was amazing, yeah, because we were forced to be away from our parents, who we were seeing on a weekly basis, just to go for Sunday dinner, and we realized that even not having that forced us to rely on each other more. And so, I don't know, you talk about forcing functions, and I think that moving away is definitely a forcing function, because and even in your story, you told the story of the guy who he moved away. He didn't want to be a smoker. And just because he was around new people, I think in the nursing home that he was working at, and they said, hey, you want to go on a smoke break? And he was able to tell them, I don't smoke. But they weren't able to easily persuade him because they just assumed, oh, okay, this guy doesn't smoke. Whereas
that's the benefit of being in a new environment, is that no one knows your backstory. So you can kind of create that backstory.
Right.
That is a benefit of fresh relationships, is that you're not defined by people's preconceived notions of who you used to be.
For sure. Maybe that's what makes it easier. If you come up with your future self and then relocate, maybe just move to a different part of the city would be beneficial for somebody. I don't know. I do have one more question before I open it up to the team, because when I was reading your book, there was this one moment where I was like, I wish he would have gone and explained more on the story. And if you're able to, great. If you can't, that's fine too. But you joined a Genius network where there was a bunch of people going to be speaking at the end of the year. And if I'm not mistaken, in the book, the whole lineup was already planned out. And you told yourself at the beginning of the year, I'm going to speak on the same stage as these other professional speakers, on the same stage as Tony Robbins. And as it looked, it wasn't going to be possible, because not only was the lineup already prepared, but you were coming into this group as a newcomer, and who are you to come in and be able to manifest that? But you manifested it, which is super impressive to me, right? Like,
I wrote about this story in Willpower Doesn't Work.
Okay.
And I actually go a little bit into Genius Network and groups like that in that book. But yeah, basically I joined the group in the summer of 2017, and I went to my first meeting in September of 2017. And during that first meeting, I actually gave a talk. And that's one of the things that I learned, is that whenever you join a group, you want to be a giver, not a taker. So you want to contribute as fast as you can. So I just joined the group and I asked if I could get a talk sharing all my blogging strategies. And by immediately sharing a talk, now everyone knew who I was. And the talk was really well prepared. I got a lot of coaching and help so that the talk would be successful. And it went so well that I was told, that was such a good talk that I'm going to recommend it to be at the annual event, even though I'm pretty sure that it's already been full. One of the guys who's in Genius Network who knows Joe really well, and he did determine that the event had been slotted and it was totally full for 6 months. But sometimes things fall out. Like sometimes people's schedules fall in, and so they just can't show up. And so I then, after that talk and after kind of being aware that could be a potential idea, I then wrote about it and said, I'm going to figure out how to get on that stage, and I think that that's a key thing, is that what you're exposed to shapes your goals. And so I decided that I want to do that. And so once you have a goal, that determines your process. And so I then went through a process of getting closer to Joe Polish, who was the founder of that network. I joined his higher level group, was able to give the talk again a month later to his higher level group. And then in the midst of all that, one of his speakers fell through. And so because I had given value multiple times, he asked his assistant, she's like, yeah, you should have Ben give that talk. And so, in November, so 2 months later, after that first talk, I was speaking on the main stage, which a lot of people who have been in that group for years have been begging and trying to do, and I just think one thing that makes this really fun, I'll just throw it out there. Like, you sometimes in moments of excitement, you have big ideas, and quickly, you can just let go of those ideas. Like you could think, I'm going to go out and do something, like something big. And sometimes in flashes of excitement or inspiration, you can feel that, but then you don't fuel that. And so the goal is that when you have those moments of inspiration or idea, you fuel it so that it becomes something you strive for daily, and you start doing things that could open that as a real legitimate possibility. So like sometimes I'll get a big idea, like I want to go be on like a really big podcast, then I stop entertaining it. And that's the problem, is when you stop entertaining it. That's why I think daily journaling and daily going for it allows you to continue to entertain it. Because if you keep entertaining something and if you keep trying for it, you'll start to figure out ways to eventually get there. We have flashes of excitement and then we quickly just downplay them and go with our day-to-day life.
Yeah. So the idea is to have this idea, like, I'm going to speak on the same stage as Tony Robbins, and it's already slotted, but I don't care. I'm just going to live my life.
There is a way to do it. No, there is a way to, there, in my mind there's gotta be a way.
Right.
I don't know what that way is.
But yeah, so even though it looks
impossible
dismal to the average person, you're like, there is a way, right? There's always a way. And so you start looking for that angle, and then you manifest it into your reality, right?
Yeah. I mean, for me, it was as simple as, if I want to do this, I should probably get closer to Joe. Because when you have a goal, you have to figure out there are steps there.
Right.
They may be crazy steps. They may be counterintuitive steps, but there are ways to open that possible door, which we're saying is manifesting. There are ways to do it. And obviously certain things go out of your control as well. But yeah, I mean, once I was like, I want to try this, then I joined this higher level group and asked if I could share the same ideas with them. So you then ask, you have to start making bold asks and start putting yourself out there. I like the definition of courage, that courage is the willingness to try something that might not work. So you got to start trying stuff that in all likelihood might not work. But it doesn't really matter, because at least you're trying.
So had it not happened that year, would you have told yourself, oh, well, this just doesn't work?
I probably would have given the talk a year later.
That's what I'm thinking too. I think that's the point I was going to make.
Yeah, it would have definitely happened. Yeah. I wasn't attached either way. Like, I like the idea, expect everything and attach to nothing, so it's like you're committed to the end result, but you're not attached to anything that occurs along the way.
I love it. So we've got about 15 minutes left. I want everybody else to have a chance to say something if they want to say something.
Yeah, if there's any questions about any of the topics we've explored, there's obviously many things we haven't explored, but whether it be former trauma, identity, whatever it is you want to talk about, if you have any specific questions or want any further deep dive, feel free to share your perspective or ask any questions.
Ben, I got a question for you. So you were talking about getting into these groups. What would you say is the importance or the importance of investing in yourself? Obviously, groups probably weren't just volunteer groups you wanted to be part of, but what would you say, maybe elaborate on that, the importance of investing in yourself?
Yeah, for sure. And Mayor Tommy Lee, would you mute yourself? Yes, I will talk about this. I think this is a very important subject. Actually, I talk about this in my TED Talk. If you look it up, it's called like the 100%. There's a story about the guy. It's a Zig Ziglar story, but I'll kind of break this down a little bit further. But he tells the story of this really overweight guy. And essentially, he got committed to a future self of a skinny version of himself. And the first thing he did was he went to a suit store and he bought 2 very fitted suits, which were obviously not going to fit his huge frame. And the guy who sold him the suits said, "Who are these for?" The guy's name was Tom Hartman. And basically, Tom said, "They're for myself." So first off, he was telling the story of his future self. He was also investing money into his future identity. And I actually did my whole master's thesis on this. In order to become an entrepreneur, you have to start investing money into that identity. I have the theory that you should invest at the level of your future self. So the bigger the investments, the bigger the psychological commitment and the bigger the identity shift. And so, yeah, you need to invest, of course. I think that people really, they don't make those investments because they have a small mindset. They don't, like I was just barely on a podcast with someone and he was in a band. They spent a whole year developing an album, but they didn't want to spend the $200 to get a photographer to make great art for the cover design. So after they spent a year on a project, they saved $200 by making their own picture and their album looked amateurish. They weren't willing to invest at the level of their goal. And obviously there's risk in investing at the level of your goal, but that's really how you start to live like the goal is going to be real. So psychologically, it's really good for your confidence, but it's also really good for your identity. And it shatters subconscious blocks, because now you're investing money at the level you want to play at. And so you start to believe it. And also you start to put yourself in situations where it's actual possible. You're around people who can help you. Yeah, I started writing in 2015, and I'd wanted to do it for 10 years, or not 10 years. I'd wanted to do it for 5 years. I got home from that mission experience in 2010. But for 5 years, I didn't really do anything towards it because I wasn't investing in that. I was investing in like college and stuff like that. But once I started buying online courses that taught me how to write viral headlines and stuff, once I started, buying mentorships and teaching me how to write, then I started to move in that direction. So I would say the sooner you start investing, the faster you're going to get there. And if you don't invest, you probably won't get there. Yeah, I would say I don't expect to get there if you're not investing money into your future identity.
Awesome. Thank you.
For sure.
Tommy, you can unmute yourself if you're going to have a question.
So my question was, what book would you say started this whole process for you? What's the root
It wasn't
book for you?
really a book, because I served that church mission. I will say the first book I was given on the subject was called As a Man Thinketh. I was given that book before that mission, but there wasn't like a book that led me to like this personal development or this psychology experience. I wanted to serve a church mission, and that experience was very transformational. I did read like Stephen Covey during that mission and things like that. And there's been great books along the way, but it wasn't a book that led me on this. It was being really devastated by my current situation. I was, when I was 19 years old, I was living on my cousin's couch playing World of Warcraft for about 15 hours a day, doing nothing. And I was not very happy. And so I ended up going on that church mission. And that's the thing that really transformed my life. And that led me to many books. I mean, I could definitely give you a list of the books I think are important, but there was no one book that led me on a
We would
path.
love that. I don't know if you don't necessarily have to go through it now, or if you want to share it with me and share with the team, because I've been writing down some of the resources. But any other quick books that you would recommend us to check out, or if you need to think about it, it's okay.
I'll think about it.
Yeah,
that list always changes. But Tommy, I don't know if you have any other questions, or is there was no specific book that led me down this path.
Yeah, that's basically the question, because right now I'm doing all the different books that the people I look up to read. So that was the question. Thank you.
Yeah, they do help. I mean, I'm always reading books. I just reread Man's Search for Meaning, but yeah, that was that experience that led me down the path.
Does anybody else have a question they want to ask? Let's see, who's on this call? Paul, do you have any questions? DJ? John Brush is on this call, Ben, my brother.
Oh, nice. Johnny.
I invited Chris to jump on here as well, but I think he was busy with work or something. If while you're thinking of your questions, Rosie, do you have a question? I know you're unmuted. Maybe it's just been unmuted the whole time. Unmute yourself if you do.
I guess the quick
No, I
question.
don't have any question.
Oh, never mind. Hold on, I'll let her go.
No, I don't have questions, but thank you.
Go ahead, Donald.
Yeah. So like, Benny sent us the chapter 3, and so I was listening to that, and my question is about like the math story, and how like math teachers have it the hardest. Why do you think like math teachers in general have it like the hardest of like overcoming in schools? Because like I'm a math guy, I love math, I love numbers, and I love tutoring people, and I understand that. But my difficulty came in like English and history, like focusing on that. So like, why do you think math in particular was like the hardest to overcome for that like teacher in that story?
I don't know if it's the hardest thing to overcome. I think that I think it'd be interesting to see how you help your students become good at dealing with challenges with math and getting better at it. Like basically what I said in the book is that a lot of teachers in the US struggle because their students develop math trauma.
Sure.
It's because math can be difficult. It's a different way of thinking. And so if you have a bad experience and you don't get good coaching or good teaching through that, then you can form a fixed mindset that you can't do it, which is essentially math trauma. So there's just a lot of students that deal with that because math is a different beast, and it's difficult and it's complex, that we all hit obstacles in our education of math. And without good teaching, we just develop the idea that we can't really do it beyond where we're at. So I think that's a common experience for math. I think it's also, as you just described, a common experience for other educations as well, whether that be reading or writing or history. Like, yeah, but I think math in general is pretty tough. And I think it's something that people hit a wall on and then they stop learning.
Awesome. Thanks for the input.
Mm-hmm.
I'll throw out another question while people are thinking, but you talked to me about the idea of selective ignorance. And people would think of ignorance as a bad thing, but what I've seen in you, Ben, is that you don't just surrender yourself to whatever knowledge comes your way. You're trying to focus. Can you speak a little bit on selective ignorance and what that means to you? What news do you watch? What books do you read? And that kind of thing.
Yeah, so this is about designing your environment. The idea is you want to be selectively ignorant, and also really I call it, selective or strategic ignorance. But yeah, it's just the idea that if stuff comes into your head, you're gonna process it in some way. And so there's certain things that you just don't want to deal with, and like in psychology, we call it decision fatigue, but there's certain things you just don't want to come into your brain because it's a waste of your time. You already know it's irrelevant to your goals. And being overly, a lot of people say you should be aware of everything. And that's really bad for decision-making because you just don't have time to be aware of everything. And so the goal is actually to remove a lot of the inputs that you already know are just not going to support your goals. So I talk about a few different people as examples. Peter Diamandis is one. He's a futurist. He just doesn't watch mainstream media because for the most part, it's not really that good of information. So he's chosen to be strategically ignorant of it. And he gets his news sources from places that are more effective for him. I tell the story of Seth Godin, who's a famous business writer, and he used to look at the comments on Amazon about his books, and he realized that by reading those comments, they made him feel inferior and they broke his confidence down. And he realized that people giving him those comments weren't giving him good feedback. They were just trying to tear him down, like writing negative reviews on his books on Amazon. So he's chosen to be ignorant of those reviews. He doesn't need those things to come into his mind because he knows that they're not going to help him achieve his goals. Seth still gets feedback, but he gets it from the right sources. And so this is kind of about it's making one choice so you don't have to think about it again. Michael Jordan said, once I made a decision, I never had to think about it again. It's good to make one decision. And what they say is like the root of the word decision is to cut off. So you want to cut off many options so you don't have to think about them. So you don't have to fill your brain with essentially useless or ineffective information. So yeah, and you can do this in many ways. I mean, you can remove apps from your phone. Just as one example, you make one decision so you don't have to think about it anymore. That eliminates decision fatigue so you don't have to wear out your willpower thinking about something. So as an example, you can remove junk food from your house so you don't have to weigh the options. Should I eat it? Once the option's gone, you don't have to think about it anymore. You don't have to deal with decision fatigue. You can use your brain to focus on the things you want to accomplish. So yeah, I think it's just good to remove many of the influences from your environment that you already know are not influences that you want to be influencing your psychology or your thinking. Just remove most of the options because most of the information or options out there are wasteful, and develop a better filter for what comes into your life. Like there's a really good quote from Robert Kiyosaki. I think he actually says it in Rich Dad, Poor Dad, but he says that intelligence is the ability to make finer distinctions. Finer distinctions is like the filter that you see the world through. So, it's better to develop a better and better filter about what hits you and about how you see the world. You don't want to just keep filling your brain with useless information. So remove most of those options and maybe even those people and those environments so that you don't even have to think about them anymore.
Perfect. Thank you. I was super impressed a few years back when I was coming home from a company cruise and Ben was in Utah and he was talking to me about this new book he was publishing. And he was telling me that he was being mentored by a guy named Ryan Holiday, who on my cruise, I just listened to Ryan Holiday's book, The Obstacle is the Way. And I was like, this Ryan Holiday guy is awesome. He's going to be up and coming. And Ben's like, oh yeah, like he helped me, he mentored me. And he's like, my first book deal is going to be, I don't want to